Right. Welcome back to U.S. History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to be covering the lessons Building Industrial America on the Backs of Labor. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to explain the qualities of industrial working class life in the late 19th century and analyze both the workers' desire for labor unions and the reasons for the unions' inability to achieve their goals. So continuing to talk about industrial America, continuing to talk about the second half of the 19th century, and today we're focusing on the working class. So as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the standard of living increased for many Americans, but working conditions remained poor for factory workers. And you can just imagine how workers felt about this contrast, right? Many Americans are getting better quality of life, but not necessarily those who are putting in the work for that better quality of life. They're not necessarily seeing the benefit. So, between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century, 1900, American workforce underwent a transformative shift. Nearly 60% of Americans still lived and worked on farms in 1865, and about 50 years later, that number had flipped, with only 40% living in rural areas. Everyone else had moved to the city or the suburbs. There was also a trend of decreasing Americans being self-employed, a trend of a decrease in American workers being self-employed and an increase of people working for others and being dependent on a factory wage system for living. So we see really the beginning of the wage era that probably most of us are familiar with today. But factory wages were, for the most part, extremely low. Remember, during this time period, there were no worker protection laws. Worker protection laws that we are familiar with today exist because of the atrocities and the horrible conditions that people lived and worked in during this time period. So in 1900, the average factory wage was approximately 20 cents an hour, which was an annual salary of just under $600. According to rough historical estimates, that wage left approximately 20% of the population in industrial cities at or below the poverty level. And then an average factory work week was 60 hours, 10 hours per day, 6 days a week, although in steel mills it was 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So there certainly wasn't the opportunity to pick up a second job to help compensate for the low wages. And so people were often trapped in cycles of poverty. And you would have families where multiple children would perhaps have to go to work in the factory rather than finishing their education because one wage and sometimes even two wages was not enough to live off of, especially if you were raising a family. So long hours and dangerous conditions, right? Typical work week was 60 hours. Steel mills even more so, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 1913 alone, 25,000 workers died on the job. And there's no compensation for this at that time. If someone died on the job, they were replaced, and whoever that worker had been providing for had to figure out a way to continue to provide for themselves. 700,000 workers were injured, missing at least a month of work. Again, unpaid. So the system was definitely set up against the factory workers. And a lot of the nature of factory work just stripped the workers of their humanity. The tasks were very repetitive, little interaction with co-workers, and they were often kind of micromanaged, or really they were supposed to be a small piece in a much larger machine. And so that definitely affected people's mental health, doing the same sort of both mentally and physically repetitive activity day after day after day, for hours and hours and hours a day, with little variety and few breaks. Took a physical toll as well as a mental toll. Now, during this time period, we also see more women in the workforce. Between 1870 and 1900, the number of working women tripled. By 1900, there were 5 million women earning a wage, and about 25% of those worked in factories. Most of these women were young, under 25, usually unmarried, and often immigrants. More and more women started working outside of the home for a variety of reasons. It was a way to perhaps take a step away from the rural farm life, or if they were an immigrant, to help provide for loved ones, a step towards independence. And women were often happy to do this, happy to have the opportunity to work, but they were often working in clothing and textile factories where their appearance was less offensive to men who felt that the heavy work was their field. We also see child labor really ramp up during this time period. Child labor in factories is going to triple between 1870 and 1900. Why? Well, you can pay children much less than adults. They often worked night shifts, and they can fit easily among large machines. And so their physically smaller size was a benefit um, to factory owners or managers who needed smaller hands and fingers to reach into certain parts of the machines and do various bits of work. So as the conditions grew worse, concerns among reformers grew as well for worker protections um, in a variety of ways. Okay, and this change took a long time to come. Some states passed basic work safety laws. There was pressure put on Congress at the national level for protective legislation, but significant changes didn't come for decades until later in the 1900s and the 20th century, largely due to money. Putting these laws in place uh, often limited the money that the factory owners were able to get, whether that was shorter work hours, um, some sort of compensation if you were injured on the job, um, getting a minimum wage put in place, like all of these things, there was pushback because it impacted financially the factory owners. So there's this huge wealth gap between the workers and the ones that they worked for. A lack of legal protection led to frustration, and some communities actually erupted in violence. There were several different kind of violent explosions where people they just lost it. So the Molly Maguires was an alleged secret society of Irish mine workers. And they were convicted for violent crimes against the coal industry because they fought back against their circumstances. Perhaps violence was not an effective strategy. Perhaps they felt like no other strategy was being heard. But the Molly Maguires were convicted of violence and actually hanged as a result. Now, business owners distrusted unions. And so as unions began to form to try, the workers were forming unions and banding together to get better rights, strengthen numbers here in unity. But business owners distrusted the unions. And at this time, the public distrusted unions as well. And there was also a lot of divisions among workers, racial divisions, ethnic divisions, cultural divisions, religious divisions. And there was still this belief in an individual work ethic over collective action. And so keeping the people, meaning the wage workers, divided made it much harder to stand up for change. Still, they continued to push. All right. So this is a more detailed thing of the Molly Maguires. We're going to skip for today. Okay. The Great Railroad Strike. Right, we mentioned that in another lesson. This was also another event of people pushing back. It started in West Virginia after railroad workers' pay was actually cut. So not only were there, no laws providing like a minimum wage, like you could also get your wages cut. And remember, these people are already living on nearly non-survivable wages. So in protest, workers banded together and striked or refused to work for 45 days. The goal of striking and not working was that the longer the work wasn't done, the more it financially hurt the company that you worked for. However, the companies during this time period were often so wealthy that they could hold out, or they could go and hire other temporary workers at an even cheaper wage because there was so much competition for jobs, and different groups perhaps would be willing to take work for a lower wage temporarily because they were desperate for work at all. And so, the powers that be kind of played these different working groups against each other to the benefit of the business owners. So the strike lasted for 45 days with no gains for the workers. They ended up gaining nothing out of this. It spread across the country, and there's actually significant violence in Pittsburgh. The president had to send in federal troops to restore order, and unfortunately, it brought no gains, no results for the workers. So people began to realize that sporadic violence was not effective and that they needed to be better organized, but it was very difficult to do. They faced a lot of obstacles, right? Again, that diversity sometimes made it hard for people to band together. But we do eventually see some labor unions start to form. The Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor. I'll talk about some of those. So the National Labor Union was formed in 1866. 77 delegates representing a variety of different occupations met in Baltimore and formed a labor union. The National Labor Union had ambitious ideas about equal rights for African Americans, women, currency reform, a legally mandated 8-hour workday. They were successful in convincing Congress to adopt the 8-hour workday for federal employees, but it did not reach much further. So the NLU was kind of the first, I don't want to say the first major attempt, but one of the first major attempts at a labor union trying to band everybody together to make a difference. But there were other attempts as well. The Knights of Labor was another union that was able to attract a more sympathetic following. And they widened who was allowed in the labor union, and the labor unions that did that allowed workers of different races and ethnicities and perhaps even genders saw more success because they just allowed more people in, and the more people were united, the more people that were united in a cause, the more success they had in bringing change about. Now, the Haymarket Affair. This is a pretty famous event in which the Knights of Labor Union's popularity and really the whole labor movement kind of took a deep dive. The Haymarket Affair occurred on May 4th, 1886 in Chicago's Haymarket Square, hence the name. Now, an anarchist group had gathered in response to a death at an earlier nationwide demonstration for the 8-hour workday. So there had been a nationwide demonstration promoting the 8-hour workday, and someone had been killed. And at the earlier demonstration, clashes between the police and the strikers had led to the death of that striking worker. And so the group decided to hold a protest the following night in Haymarket Square. And although the protest was quiet, the police arrived armed for conflict. Someone in the crowd threw a bomb at the police. So someone in the crowd did start violence. Doesn't mean that the crowd is in general approved of it, right? These things always get really murky when it does come to crowds. So someone in the crowd threw a bomb at the police, killing an officer and injuring another. And then 7 of the anarchists speaking at the protest were arrested and charged with murder. And they were later sentenced to death, although 2 were pardoned and 1 committed suicide in prison before his execution. So just a lot of these attempts at peaceful protest and change ending in violence. It's going to take a long time for workers to see major change. Okay, so the event of a couple of different strikes, the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892 and the Pullman Strike from 1894. Again, I'm not talking about every single strike because there's quite a bit. Really kind of crushed the labor movement for about 30, 40 years. And so with the violent events of the late 1800s and the 1890s, there's a series of events. The labor movement really lost its steam, and workers kind of remained in crappy situations unprotected for some decades before America and the government and society was ready for another wave of reform movements to get better rights for workers. All right, and that's it for today.